Ladies and gentlemen, dear spectators of tonight's discussion, a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Martin Meyer. I'm the chairman of the Swiss Institute of International Studies at Zurich University. It's great to have you here with us. Thank you. This is a live stream from the Swiss Center of Global Dialogue, organized by the Center and our institute. We are very pleased to present you the eminent scholar, journalist, and writer Constanze Stelzenmüller in conversation with the philosopher and political analyst Katja Gentinetta. Constanze Stelzenmüller holds the Fritz Stern Chair at the distinguished Brookings Institution and is a widely traveling expert on European and transatlantic foreign and security politics. We are very proud to have you here, Constanze. The topic of our discussion when we prepared it some months ago read "End of the Pax Americana?" Today's situation and the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine have changed this perspective and also its question, of course, in a very dramatic way, which also means never try to predict history. It will fool you at the most unexpected moment. This said, our format is extremely timely, also in respect to the fact that the Pax Americana has hopefully not ended yet. On the contrary, never was it more important to protect freedom against tyranny and ruthless violence than now and tomorrow, of course, too. Europe under Russian threat? Indeed. More than 20 years of having been naive and looking away pay back now. What does this mean? What can we do? How can we help a country and a people who have reinvented bravery and self-confidence under terrible circumstances? These are important questions. I wish us a fruitful and inspiring evening, not least to give us the strength which is needed now all over Europe and the free world. We decided to hold this discussion in English. We will reach an even broader audience. Thank you, Constanze, thank you, Katja. The floor is entirely yours.
So thank you, Martin, for this kind introduction, and very welcome, Constanze Stelzenmüller, also from my side to the SIAF. And very welcome the audience in the room and at home. As always, you are invited to ask your questions by the chat, and we will look at these questions and at your questions at the end of our discussion. Yes, we're now, or let's say tomorrow, we will be in week 3 of the war in Ukraine. We see bombed cities, there are thousands of civilians dead, millions of people fleeing from the country, coming into Europe, into our Europe. Just to start a quick look back, Constanze, on the 21st of February, were you surprised on the invasion or not?
I'm afraid not, sadly. For one, I am surrounded at Brookings with a couple of very distinguished Russia experts like Angela Stent and above all the incomparable Fiona Hill, some of you might have seen her speak at the famous second impeachment hearings of President Trump, where she played a non-minor role. That's what made her internationally famous. And had always gotten the impression from them that they were extremely pessimistic about the outlook for what was going to happen. And then in November, at the end of November of last year, in early December, I finally, the travel ban was lifted in Washington. under which I also fell because I don't have a green card. So I couldn't, I could leave the country, but I couldn't have come back. And I went and saw a couple of people in Berlin who had better information than I had, and who were literally bowed down with worry. I had never seen people like that. And I think one of them said to me, I've been in diplomacy for nearly 40 years, and this is the worst thing I have ever seen. And we're talking about late November, early December. And I came back from this and thought, this is going to happen. And then the point at which I decided that it was going to happen was I think 2 days before Christmas, when the Kremlin sent these so-called quote-unquote draft treaties to Washington and Brussels, NATO. And I believe it was a Thursday or Friday, and Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said, as far as we're concerned, this can be signed as is on Saturday. So making very clear that what this was an ultimatum to the West. And this was not just about Ukraine, it was about much, much more. It was about rolling back the democratic transformation of Eastern Europe. It was about neutralizing Western Europe and pushing the Americans out of the continent. And that was the point when it became clear to me that Putin was, as they say in America, well ahead of his skis. Should appeal to you here as well. As a metaphor, you know what I mean. You lean forward, you lose control, and you go down like an avalanche. And I thought, this can only end in violence, and I don't think it ends in a Russian victory. But I have to say that I went to the Munich Security Conference in February and flew back on the 23rd. And when I woke up on the 24th to news that the war had started, I just, I started crying. Mm. It was just, I had been living in dread for weeks. And the fact that it was finally happening was just horrific.
Yes, I mean, what you're telling us is that what we all a bit felt, I mean, maybe we were hoping that it would not happen, but those who listened well should have known that it will happen. Mm. And we had these warnings, especially from the Biden administration. Yeah. We saw all the weapons on the borders.
But Putin told us.
Yes, and
this is it. Mm-hmm. And the weapons on the borders told us.
Yes, exactly.
To suggest that these weapons were just there to, give an impression was, I think, to fundamentally underestimate what this man was planning. Mm-hmm.
Yes, but you say Putin told us, and this is one of the mysteries of this man, that we know that we cannot taking literally what he says. He tells us things we don't know. Are these threats? Are these provocations? Are it lies? Or does it really mean it? So we always have to estimate on what he says and what his administration says, his people say. What does he mean with it?
So my answer to that is, I think we have to take him seriously when he articulates an ultimatum, and I think we should not take him seriously when he says he's going to negotiate. And I remember very vividly watching the press conference with Macron and then the press conference with Scholz when I was already in Munich. And literally, in both cases, Putin lied to the President of France and the Chancellor of Germany through his teeth, without batting an eyelid. And then the very next day, the Kremlin speaker Peskov said, no, we're not going to do any of that. And you have that, you watch that a couple of times, and then you say, all right, nobody will ever believe you again. Mm-hmm. Which is why, obviously, I'm slightly hesitant about the current negotiations.
Yes, I mean, that's what would have been my next questions. How do you assess these negotiations? I mean, in German, they're translated as peace negotiations, which cannot be the case. I mean, it's first a negotiation about ending the war and stopping the weapons. But
so I think there are a couple things here that are dubious at best. I mean, I have to say, one has to applaud the astounding courage and the stone-cold nerves of Zelensky for talking to this man, for even being willing to entertain meetings and discussions with somebody who has been indiscriminately shelling your cities and killing your citizens, shelling a maternity hospital and killing pregnant women. I mean, I don't think I would be able to control my anger in such a situation. But apart from that, the emotional part, I mean, that's probably why I'm not president of anything. But you look at the sort of 15 points that the FT says today that they're discussing, and you think, well, For one, the Russians want independence for the two zombie states, Donetsk and Luhansk. It's not quite clear whether they want the rest of the Donbass as well. That's going to be a question. Also, if the Russians get the Donbass, or parts of it, they no longer have a handle on the government in Minsk, the government in Kiev, which they did have with the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement gave them a word in Kiev politics. So in other words,
why Zelensky was hesitating.
Exactly, and that's the first reason why I think this doesn't really work for Moscow or for the Kremlin. The other question is neutrality for Ukraine, and they seem to be talking about Austria or Sweden. And what I have to say I'm now learning, because I'm not an expert on neutrality statutes, what I'm now learning is that Austrian neutrality worked because there was, again, a hard American nuclear guarantee. The Americans were of the view that the Danube Valley was so strategically important that they made it very clear that if the Soviets violated Austrian neutrality, there would be a nuclear response. Sorry, this was news to me. I've just learned this. But, that is a definition of neutrality that probably your Normalbürger, your normal person, doesn't associate, right?
Switzerland is defending itself in the case of
exactly.
neutrality.
As well, I have a Swiss
That's
uncle.
what we assume.
I have a Swiss uncle who had a backpack and a gun in his armoire. So, and
the militia.
So, yes.
That's the Swiss militia. In
exactly,
any case,
I remember
yes.
that. But I think that these things no longer really work, and I think that a security guarantee vis-a-vis an aggressor who has behaved the way the Russians have, I think would require very significant Western involvement. And I also think none of this is really good for Moscow, right? This is not a win for Putin. I don't think that this is good for his retirement. And if I were him, I'd be looking over my back all the time at this point. And you and I were talking earlier, there's Naryshkin, the head of the FSB, remember the man who was humiliated by Putin in this press conference in front of millions of watchers. Naryshkin's apparently is quoted today in the media as saying, these hours and days will be deciding the future of Russia. And that, frankly, that to me sounds like a bit of a warning. Mm-hmm. And it's not so much a warning to us as to one person. So.
Yes, it's of course a warning to him, but it's also a warning to us. And I wanted to come back to the question, to what extent shall we believe what Putin says? I think it was on day 2 or 3 in the war when he told about the nuclear threat. Yeah. He didn't say it literally,
he implied
but for everyone it was clear that he was talking about this. How do you estimate this threat? And what for me is interesting to see that now it's 2 weeks ago, and it's almost normal that it is there. We don't even talk about it anymore. Well, we're now talking about biological and chemical weapons. So is it a sort of provocation, or is it really in the room?
Well, again, it was a shocking violation of the post-war civilizational consensus to even put that threat out there for a major Security Council member nuclear power. That hasn't happened. If this is North Korea, right? If it's Pakistan or India, it's one thing. We're sort of used to that, and we're used to dealing with it. For the Russians to do it was truly shocking. And again, there's been obviously a great deal of internal anxious discussion in Washington over the likelihood of Russia using theater nuclear weapons, which is what we're talking about, I think. And in what kind of scenarios this would be conceivable for the Russians. And again, I have to quote my brilliant colleague, Fiona, who said, I think you have to understand that if he has it, he thinks he can use it. Mm-hmm. But the other thing about the threat of bioweapons, this is another thing that's come up. It's become a meme, the American right, Tucker Carlson, who is adored by the Russian media, saying the Ukrainians have US-funded bioweapon labs, which is ridiculous. But apparently this goes back quite a long time. It's always been part of Russian disinformation. And one of the problems with these wild accusations from the Kremlin is that very often they will accuse other people of things that they're planning to do. So again, this caused significant alarm in Washington. And I think it was then again sort of made quietly clear to the Kremlin that they would be in very, very big trouble.
I mean, this is his strategy for years now, that he accuses the West to do what he does.
Exactly.
It's starting with lies and fake news, so
Yeah,
it's always the same game. The question is, there was many discussions about Putin's psychology, about his character, and neither you nor me are psychologists, but we know very well that he is not only a rational president. He is also obsessed by, let's say, making Russia great again. And the question for me is, how do you deal with this in a war? I mean, the West has these sanctions that are very hard, but do they really arrive up to him? Does he realize that there are sanctions, and are they enough?
Yeah, so two things. I think we have to separate out the sanctions from what makes, what can constrain Putin. I think on the sanctions, we all know these are historic in volume and scope. Switzerland has participated in them, also can't have been politically easy for Switzerland. I also think it's entirely possible that they are not the end of the line. But we've also, we're also seeing more demands in public debate, like, complete cut-off of energy imports, which would be, I think, highly problematic for the economies and the politics of European countries that are heavily dependent on those imports. But I think that the freezing of the central bank's assets is truly brutal and far more important than the daily income that Russia still generates from its ongoing energy imports. Those, and again, they are not, I think, everybody who understands how Putin and this Kremlin, his enabler cronies work, there is never much hope that these sanctions would function as a deterrent. What they will do, I think, though, is they will function as a constraint. And that's different. That means that they're shaping their policy options, and, I mean, rather than shaping, one should probably say severely limiting policy options. Now, there is an inherent risk in that, of course, it makes the use of certain weapons possibly more likely. That's where the sort of quiet conversations come in, I think. Now, on the question of getting Putin to change his behavior, I mean, arguably, you'd have to say that that's currently happening. I mean, the Kremlin has, in the past week or so, dialed down its maximalist language. I mean, remember that this is a guy saying that a Ukrainian government with a Jewish president and defense minister needed to be denazified, right? Truly shocking language. Shelling nuclear plants, 2 of them in Ukraine, threatening to use nuclear weapons. And the fact that they're now willing to talk about independence for Donbass and neutrality for Ukraine is already a significant climb down. I think the thing that I hadn't mentioned is something in that 15-point plan that sounds like a partial demilitarization. That's something I really don't see happening. But frankly, I think the only thing that stops Putin is his inner circle, and by which I do not mean the oligarchs. I think the oligarchs have become politically irrelevant. They've been sidelined in recent years. And the people who do matter, the inner circle, the siloviki, are people for whom, no doubt money matters, but I think what matters more is Russia's status and standing on the world stage, and that's something that Putin has single-handedly destroyed within the past 2 weeks. So I can't imagine that they would be happy, but that is where I think that's the only place from which Putin can be stopped, in my view.
I mean, and these sanctions, they touch them as well. But even if you think so far, and you say the inner circle is the only one who can stop Putin, how will this happen? I mean, it's not easy to predict, but I mean, the question could be, there are several options. I mean, either he was going to be replaced by somebody who is more or less similar,
sure, or
is it going to be replaced by somebody who's really different and trying to something else? Regarding, and this was my other question, I mean, the sanctions only touch the people on the street. And they're not on the street anymore because they face serious threats as well. So this combination...
Yeah, those are all really, really good points, but let's try and separate those out. I was tempted just now, so I'll give in to the temptation and say, has anybody seen The Death of Stalin, the movie?
Yes.
I can...
I'm also thinking
the Russians,
of that.
The Russians have a glorious political tradition of getting, sort of, shall we say, assuring early political retirement for people who, do no longer sort of produce a positive cost-benefit analysis for the people who enable them. And I have to say that after what Putin has perpetrated, what I think we all have to call war crimes, and which has, I think, single-handedly revived not just the International Criminal Court, which I think was kind of on its way out because the Americans had been withdrawing support, but also the International Court of Justice, which today ruled that this was a crime of aggression and that the Russians needed to stop. This is the single biggest boost to international criminal law that we've seen, I think, in 2 decades since the statute came into force, which is remarkable. I mean, that's, I'm sure, not what Putin wanted. But the question of public opinion is a really important one, and I'm glad you raised it. Let me put it this way. There is a tradition, I don't know what it's like in Switzerland, but there is a tradition in Germany, and it strikes me that this is a generational thing, of suggesting that the Russians sort of, and other non-Western people sort of, are quite happy living in dictatorships. Konrad Adenauer, the first Chancellor of Germany, was quoted as muttering under his breath when he took a train from Bonn, near where he lived, to Berlin, of muttering that he was going to ASEAN, Berlin. So imagine what these people thought about Russia. And honestly, I thought about the long-time strategy that Germany had of Wandel durch Annäherung, bringing Russia into the sort of the Eurasian fold through economic rapprochement. There was always more than a little element of civilizational hubris and arrogance there, because the assumption really was that they would learn democracy from us, and we would bring them to democracy, leading them by their hairy paws, like a sort of country cousins. And of course, it went completely the other way. The rapprochement went upstream rather than downstream. It was the German businesses who got burned in Russian trade, and nobody got democratized. But what I think that assumption has consistently underrated is, I think, the vitality of Russian civil society. Now, what we're seeing now, the kind of protests that we're seeing, the famous one with the editor at the TV station who jumped behind the moderator and held up the sign,
which is extremely courageous.
Which was extremely courageous of her, even if she was for years an enabler of that system. But frankly, kudos to her for having changed her mind. Apparently, there are reports of editorial groups sort of leaving newsrooms in droves. This doesn't compare to the Navalny protests a few years ago, where Russians really went on the streets in the hundreds of thousands, and that clearly really scared Putin, which is part of why there was this broad-based crackdown on NGOs, on foreign political foundations and Memorial and other things. But I sense that from what I'm hearing, even from my sort of handful of Russian friends who have been very outspoken on social media in ways where I thought, my God, you're really painting a target on your back. Is this safe for you to do? And people are so morally outraged and so distraught and so, literally, rending their clothes in anguish at this, that it seems to me that this, I think that this too is something that Putin and his cronies have badly miscalculated. And even if we arrive, because of these negotiations, at some sort of, provisional equilibrium, I find it hard for all the reasons that we've discussed, his psychology, the mood in civil society, the events in Ukraine, the mood of Ukrainians, and the mood in the West. I find it very hard to find any reason to assume that such a provisional equilibrium could become stable. I don't see this happening at all.
I mean, the question is what do we still have to expect? I mean, we know that, yes, it is, of course, very difficult, but the question is, the whole, the Europe and the NATO is delivering weapons, is delivering money at a large scale. Now there are foreign fighters. So for Putin, it's very easy to say NATO is already at war with us. So it's him to decide whether NATO is at war with him or not. So even if there are no boots on the ground, we can imagine serious other cyber attacks to Western cities, countries, infrastructure, etc. Could that go in a wrong way?
Sure. I mean, I think we have to be brutally honest about this, and that Putin has escalation dominance here, for the simple reason that he has clearly no ethical restraint and very little strategic restraint. Whereas we have rules, right? We're Western democracies. There's things we do not do. And Western leaders are bound also, apart from, strategic choices and moral choices, also, I think, have to consider the long game. So they have to be prudent, and they have to be balanced, and they have to be reciprocal. All of which is really difficult when you're dealing with somebody for whom there are no limits. But, I mean, the worst thing we could do is to overreact, which is what he's waiting for.
Yes.
The worst thing is to play out all our cards at once, which is also, I think, what he would be hoping for. And so I think we have to recognize with sort of calmly and neutrally that he has escalation dominance. That said, there's things he hasn't done. And he hasn't even done on the battlefield in Ukraine. There's been almost no use of cyber attacks. Interesting. Whereas the Ukrainians have been apparently very good in information operations, not just in countering propaganda and disinformation, also in public messaging, which the Russians have been terrible at. But also, I gather, and this is not my sort of real expertise, so I am saying this with cum kilosalis, in sort of countering cyber stuff. But I think there was an expectation in the West that the Russians would basically jam, the entire sort of digital domain, and that hasn't happened.
So we don't know whether it hasn't happened.
Exactly. We don't know why it hasn't happened, and we don't know, of course, whether it will happen. But it seems to me that the Kremlin, has sort of badly miscalculated on a number of counts, and I find it hard to imagine that, given what's going on, that there would be something like a surprise attack. What I do think, however, I think we should contemplate and plan for is what I was saying just now, which is a situation that is so inherently unstable that the logic of aggression becomes completely compelling for Putin, and he finds himself compelled to do something. And that we need to be prepared for, both in the protection of Ukraine and Ukrainians, and in the protection of NATO and the European Union. That is where I think the EU summit and the NATO summit next week have to go. And that is not something that you do from one day to the next. That, I think, is a generational undertaking for all of us. We can go into greater detail if you want, but I don't want to engage in a monologue here. So, but that's something I think that we're going to have to think long and hard about.
The question would be, does he have an off-ramp and all this? But I would like to have a greater outlook now. Behind Russia, or we don't even really know, is China. Is it really behind Russia or not? We have the official statement that it is not. Apparently, their media are embedded in Ukraine. Apparently, the media in China are with Russia. So, what is their strategy? Aren't they at an important point to decide whether to be just a great power or a great power with some sort of responsibility in the world?
So I don't think, to take you up on your last point, I don't think that the way the Chinese think about this, and I'm not a China expert, again, I'm listening to my colleagues who know more in Brookings and other places in Washington, I don't think that this is about the Chinese thinking of themselves as responsible stakeholders, to use the famous term coined by Bob Zoellick when he was head of the World Bank. That's not that. But I think the Chinese have a global dominance strategy that is very different from that of Russia, and that is being challenged and undercut and complicated by what the Russians are currently doing. And frankly, if I were a Western policymaker, I would exploit that. And
How would you exploit that?
Well, I'll come to that. Let me explain what I mean. For the Kremlin, I think it's important, I'm sure, at some point we would have also come to the question, was the Kremlin really threatened by NATO, right? In my view, no. And,
of course, I would say no.
No, exactly.
I would say no.
I mean, there's a lot of historians' ink spilled on this. Mary Serrati, the American historian, has written good books about this. Basically, there were conversations about this, but nothing like assurances. And there were several rounds of NATO enlargement that the Russians not only didn't object to, they tolerated. Yeah? And we still had productive relationships with them, dealing with Iran. The JCPOA wouldn't have happened without the Russians working with us. The Russians worked with us on getting Milosevic to climb down. If the Russians hadn't said to Slobodan Milosevic at the end of the Kosovo Air War, it's over, you've lost, it wouldn't have ended. Yeah? So I think, those two instances, I think, are, sort of make the point that the Russians were perfectly capable of working constructively with the West, the Western alliance, and with NATO when they thought that was in their interest. And I think what we're seeing now is a sort of decline of the sort of post-Cold War Russia into a sort of Stalinist, autocracy that it wasn't before, that is entirely about the power vertical, entirely about the power of one man in the Kremlin to the exclusion of others, a man who clearly no longer gets advice or listen to it. And that is, I think, a different proposition for the, you may not like them, but very clever and very well-trained bureaucrats like Lavrov or Elvira Nabiullina, the head of the Russian central bank. That must be deeply concerning to them. And
China
again,
now.
Yes, I'm coming to China. I'm sorry, but the larger point I was trying to make. I'm sorry, I wasn't. I was waffling. It's a little bit jet lagged. The larger point, in my view, is that for the Russians, the bigger threat than NATO was the EU, and NATO isn't the systemic challenge. The EU is, because it was the EU that was expanding as well. The EU that was democratizing. We took in Turkey when it was anything but a democracy as NATO. But the EU has to, yes, we've had problems with Hungary and Poland, but the EU makes much stricter demands on the internal workings, the operating systems of countries than NATO ever did. And that was what the real threat was. Remember that Crimea broke out after the EU offered a DCFTA of unparalleled depth and scope to Ukraine. And that was when things sort of went downhill from the point of view of the Kremlin. So, again, coming to China, for Putin and Putin's Kremlin, the EU is something that needs to be delegitimized, undermined, and if possible, broken up. Hence the support for right-wing and left-wing populist parties in Europe, hence the disinformation and propaganda flows into Europe. Now, for the Chinese, the situation is completely different. The Chinese actually need the European Union for their global strategy. They need the single market, economies of scale, and they need the physical and digital single space of Europe. And those plans, they're plans of, as it were, gently enveloping Europe into their system of transportation, digital networks, and all the while sort of undermining the politics of Europe when they find it necessary. Those plans are significantly, severely challenged by what the Russians are doing now, and that cannot be, I would imagine that would make the Xi Jinping's very nervous. If any of you watched the proceedings in Munich, when, what's his name, Wang Yeqi was interviewed by Ischinger from Munich to Beijing on a video link, the last third of Wang Yeqi's speech was about the need of Europe and China to work together. As in, leave the Americans aside, ignore the Russians. We need to work together. You and we, we can do this. And so, I mean, I would be, and I think that must have been the point of Jake Sullivan's, the National Security Advisor of Biden, conversation in Rome with the Chinese. I would have said, this is not good for you. And as for the Russians are now vassals of the Chinese. I cannot imagine that the Narishkins of this world and his other Siloviki are very happy with the state of affairs.
They are surely not happy what is happening now, but if we see what, yes, okay, China wants to cooperate with Europe, this is one thing, but it also wants to dominate the world.
Yeah, true.
And it has a completely other strategy by dominating its people, by fencing its people in through the internet, through the social media, etc.
Right.
So the Russians and the Chinese are very good friends, and they are very different from the West. So let's assume that we have really a shift now to Asia, and that we find after this war, whenever there is an after this war, that we find a strong Asia and Russia together against a West. We might live in really two divided spaces, internet, regarding the internet, regarding the financial market, regarding the democracy versus autocracy. So, and then, if we then even combine the Russian and the Chinese technological and military abilities, this could be a very harsh world for the West.
I don't know, again, I'm not very sound on Chinese military strategy. But I do wonder, I think that both Russia and China have spent huge amounts of their national budgets on modernizing their militaries. And the thing about this is that you can have very good hardware, but clearly the one thing that the Russians didn't consider was the people that you need to operate this, right? The Russians, of the 100 to, according to estimates, anywhere between 110 and 130,000 soldiers that are around or in Ukraine from the Russian armed forces. Conscripts, national reserves, or National Guard and reserves. Many of whom clearly have morale problems for one reason or the other. Because they're badly treated, they're badly paid, they're badly supplied, and their mother is Ukrainian, right? All these things, I think, are difficult. And that's something we may not have paid enough attention to the people factor in this. And I sort of wonder with the Chinese, honestly. I think that there's a risk of, I think, always imagining our enemies as, 100 foot tall. We shouldn't think of them as 3 foot tall either. But I think if I were working in intelligence or geopolitical risk assessment, I would now start trying to find out and calibrate my knowledge about the the software, the mindset, and the people in these armed forces. And I'm sure there's work out there, but I would intensify that. That's it. If the Russians and the Chinese ganged up, and, for example, the Chinese attacked Taiwan with Russian support, or even if the Chinese voice avert support now with the Russians, imagine, we have a provisional truce in Ukraine, and all the while the Chinese then start supplying the Russians with the kind of military weapons they're said to have asked for. That will create a climate of profound apprehension in Western capitals, and I think put, another rocket booster underneath the discussions about NATO deterrence and defense, and European resilience. So in other words, I don't have a straight answer for you. All I'm saying is I can see pathways here.
Yeah.
But many of some of them where I think we need to be careful in not over imagining the adversary, but where we also need to be very, very careful about how we how we judge this. And I can certainly see scenarios where this goes very badly.
Yes, of course. I mean, what we live now, we didn't really think of it before, long before.
Absolutely.
So let's leave China already and let's go around the globe and coming to the US and with the US a bit closer also to the NATO again. I mean, you already told that this NATO expansion to the east is more than propaganda because there was no threat, and if that would have been the reason, the war didn't take place. But the question now is, what is the NATO thinking behind? I mean, of course, it is stationing now people and military at the borders, but regarding the saying of a neutral Ukraine, does it really need a new order for this zone in between Russia and the West, or do we just have to go to the end to change Russia?
So let me say something, put a sort of proposition out there, which is something I actually sort of bizarrely wrote down in 2009 in a Foreign Affairs article, which is that I think we have to recognize that on the Eurasian continent, there is a systemic competition between Europe and a Russia that is governed the way this Russia is. And certainly with the sort of Stalinized Russia of Vladimir Putin. I think we have to, for the longest time, Europeans were not willing to talk about this or to conceptualize this as systemic competition. I think with Putin's behavior now and the crackdown in Russia before that and now, we have to understand this is, for the foreseeable future, by definition, adversarial relationship that we can try and mitigate, and we can carve out sort of areas of cooperation. But with a Kremlin that has revealed itself to think the way it does, I think you're not going to have dialogue and deterrence, right? That's, at this point, I think we can exclude that. That's not an easy thing to say. I would prefer to be able to say, yes, we can have dialogue and deterrence and Ostpolitik and all that. But I do not think. I think that has been substantially invalidated, that proposition. What that means, I think, is that if we talk, if we negotiate, if we try to carve out areas of cooperation, say on North Korea, Iran, space, then we have pandemic management. Then we have to do so from a position of strength, which is exactly what governments in the West, including the German government and Helmut Schmidt, did during the Cold War. Honestly, when I was a student going to law school, during the big anti-missile, the anti-Pershing demonstrations in Bonn in the 1980s, I was probably sort of on the wishy-washy liberal side of things. Yeah? I mean, I wasn't exactly anti-missile, but I wasn't particularly for them either. Yeah? Now I think, we have I've actually thought for a while that we have really let our resilience and defensive capabilities fall into échéance. Yeah? Basically we outsourced our security as Germans to America.
The whole Europe did it.
Energy, yes, but we more than most. The thing to understand, if I may sort of briefly reflect on the German situation here. When I was an adolescent and went to university, Germany was, I was a citizen of one of two Germanys, both of whom were nervous Cold War frontline states. My entire generation of West Germans grew up sort of agonizing over acid rain and the death of the forests in what I always thought was a displacement neurosis, about a displacement and neurosis that was in reality about knowing that if there was if the mutual assured destruction ever broke down, the stable equilibrium of mutual assured destruction broke down, there would be 3 weeks of a conventional war, and then somebody would light a nuclear weapon, and then we would all be a heap of smoldering ash. I do think that a great deal of American angst is explained, German angst, West German angst, is explained by this proposition. And I'm actually not joking. I think that is, I always remind my American friends that it's important to keep that in mind. That was the way you thought about how war would go. And so you have this miraculous fall of the wall that a lot of people contributed to, but not people like me, and that sort of fell into our laps. And one of, I think, the great mistakes of the German 89 generation was sort of looking at this and concluding from the fall of the wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the whole sort of waves of democratic revolutions in South Korea, in Latin America, in Africa, that this was somehow a validation of post-war West German atonement and reconciliation.
It was also the theory of Fukuyama. I mean, that's what he said. It was the end of history, and now democracy and liberty is going to live forever.
But we thought, we did this. We did this. We are suddenly, from being the pariahs and the Tätervolk, we are now the heroes of 1989 because we did this. I'm caricaturing a little bit. I'm caricaturing a little bit, but it's not. But and the other thing that we did, of course, is we through NATO and EU enlargement acquired what in German you would call a Speckgürtel, a security buffer and an economic hinterland that both pushed out our security dilemma that previously had taken place at the inner German border to the Eastern European flank, and we acquired this huge economic hinterland that we were only too happy to include into our value-added chains. Yeah? And so not only were we validated morally, we also got rich and secure. And so, of course, there was an incentive to ignore anything that could undermine this assumption that we were now going to be happy, safe, and prosperous forever, and the good guys forever, right?
Yes.
And which is why it was so astounding, that we're now actually seeing a rethink in German politics.
And it's quite a shift. I mean, it's really a turning point for Germany because it's the first statement on this since the end of World War II. Will it last?
Quite, but yes.
Do you think will it last, and what will it make to Europe?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I do think it will last. Here's why. So for me, I mean, this dates me, but I have covered sort of the German armed forces sort of going out and doing stuff pretty much since the beginning. Not Cambodia, where we sent a handful of medics. Then I was still, I wasn't there yet, but I went to Somalia as an intern at Tagesspiegel, and I covered the Bundeswehr going everywhere else, transport planes in Kigali, the Balkans, and then Afghanistan. And it seems to me that that this is the third significant vendor turnaround in German security policy. One was shooting in anger in the course of the Kosovo campaign. And finally, a German general heading a NATO division that went into Kosovo to occupy it as a peacekeeping force. And that was something that was preceded by the Schröder-Fischer government, ironically, which had not even been sworn in yet, having to sign off on a NATO activation order on October 12th. In other words, an activation order for NATO fighter bombers to hit Belgrade as punishment, deterrence for what they were perpetrating against the Kosovo Albanians. And having to sign off on that because they hadn't been sworn in, together with the outgoing Kohl and Kickl government, which was astonishing. The second jumping off point was the so-called Munich consensus in 2014, where the German president, foreign minister, the defense minister, Gauck, von der Leyen as defense minister, and Steinmeier as foreign minister, all got up and said, we have a power that is not matched by the responsibility we're taking. This has to change. But because this was rhetoric and wasn't underpinned financially or with planning decision, it sort of petered out under Merkel's sort of, very sort of prudent, incremental leadership. And Merkel was deeply uninterested in security policy and in the Bundeswehr. And this is different because A, it's a new generation, B, it's social democrats. This is kind of like a Nixon to China moment. It takes a social democrat changing his mind completely for this to stick. If it had been conservatives, the Social Democrats and the Greens would be in violent opposition now, I assure you. Finally, putting numbers to this, saying we will, for us, for Germany at this point, to move to actually spending 2% of defense means adding 50% onto our defense budget, which is now we've already moved within 2-3 years from 33 billion euro to 50 billion, and we are proposing to add 25 billion onto that by 2024, which is astounding. And we're adding this 100 billion upfront investment to that. And plus, cancelling Nord Stream 2, de facto cancelling it, and buying the F-35s. Who would have thought that? Armed drones, 2 LNG terminals, and I'm probably forgetting other stuff. But these things are huge. This is a real sea change.
The question for Europe, what
Yes.
does this mean?
Thank you. Sorry, I'd forgotten that. What does it mean?
For me, there are two
easy.
things to think of. I mean, the first thing is, okay, finally they understood, or let's say finally Europe understood that you cannot have a community of values and law if you don't have the power to defend it. The other thing is, I thought, okay, Macron, he told us about his strategic autonomy, this vision, and this could match. It could match very well, but it could also fall into rivalry. So who is going to be at the front of this? Is it going to be Germany or France?
Right.
Are they going to ally, knowing that France with NATO is not always in clear terms?
Right. So there's several aspects to this, which I think we have to disentangle. But you raised all of them now, and I'll just try and put them side by side. Let me start off by saying, by noting two aspects of this current transatlantic cooperation, which are absolutely unique, historically unique, we haven't seen before. One is that, for the first time in post-war history of the Transatlantic Alliance, the Europeans and the European Union are actually pulling their weight. They're actually doing burden sharing. And why is that? Because our preferred instrument is economic. Where the costs for Europe are much higher than for America. Now, you can say that's because we're so much more exposed to the Russian economy than the American economy is. But that gives it all the more credibility. Sanctions only work if they hurt the sanctioner as well, and we're doing that. And that is very unusual. It is deeply appreciated in Washington. The Americans are really thunderstruck at what we've been willing to do. That said, I now come to the second point, which may strike you as paradoxical, and it comes into what you were asking, which is that none of this would have happened without American diplomacy. I'm certain. Why? Because the Americans detoxed Germany for Europe. The Americans gave Merkel in her outgoing months and Scholz as an incoming chancellor a huge advance of trust, for which President Biden, in his astounding Irish stubbornness, expended personal political capital. In the summer, standing up to a very, very angry bipartisan front in Congress that wanted to sanction Nord Stream 2 immediately, and saying, I am not going to sanction the Germans. Yeah? That was a huge Vertrauensvorschuss, an advance of trust. And the Germans did not repay it then. The Germans basically said, okay, taking it, didn't do much. Kept saying, Nord Stream 2 is private economic undertaking, we have nothing to do with this, which was embarrassing. Shameful, really. What that means is, and I think you can't say this in Berlin often enough, is that, you can think about the Peace Party and its democratic issues, and certainly the Orban, you can have real issues with that. But it is at the same time true that we, Germany, are not trusted, and not least because we are, and brings me to a Swiss comparison, we are suspected of wanting to be a greater Switzerland. Yeah? In other words, be protected by everybody. Yeah. Well, also no, but like Switzerland, in sort of operating from the réduit of our sort of the comfortable sort of terrain around us from which we profit economically and to which we have outsourced our security problems. And the fact that we've now decided to do it differently and to genuinely engage isn't that much less scary for the Poles or the Czechs. And so the question remains of how we manage the imbalance of power between what are now two great powers in Europe, no longer three, so France and Germany, vis-a-vis the much smaller ones, which generates real military issues. None of the small countries in Europe these days have full-spectrum military forces. What they have is boutique forces. That requires a force spectrum, force backbone, and until now, and probably for a lot of the future, has been American armed forces. Now, the Germans have actually been thinking about this and saying, well, for small to medium-sized operations, we ought to be able to provide the backbones, and you can then sort of add your boutique forces to that, your specialized forces. That would make a great deal of sense, but for that, we needed to be politically reliable, right?
And these are discussions to come. I mean,
this is really, they are. And this is going to be militarily and technologically complex. It's going to be complex in terms of industrial-based development. Yeah? And the question remains, which I'm sure you were getting at as well, is what happens in America in the midterms in November and what happens in the presidential elections in 2024. I've never liked the Macron sort of idea of strategic autonomy, because I think that it is basically an imaginative stretch too far for me and for many Germans. But the truth is that we need to carry a much greater weight, and that we have to be able to do certain things on our own.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is the big lesson of it.
Yeah.
One really last question to you, and then I will open to the audience. I mean, what strikes me, and I'm not going only to Ukraine now, but up to Afghanistan, what we lived last year, or was it this year? It's such a long time ago. That I really asking myself, Europe and the West was standing on its values, on its law, on rationality, on regarding costs, benefits, analysis, and all this, humanitarian law, international law, etc. And what we live now is that all these instruments are just worthless in this case. And the question for me is, regarding what we live now in Ukraine, regarding that we left Afghanistan, that now there are the Taliban again, and we have to help them somehow, but we accept that they are there again. Is this going to produce somehow a more modest West, saying, okay, we are able to live and we want to live our values, we want to be able to defend them, but we're not anymore going to the whole world and saying that we have the only thing which is worth living, and we're going to export it.
You know, again, we could talk about this all evening, because this is, you know, strategically complex, it's morally complex, politically complex. And I think you have to say, and again, this sort of covers my own personal trajectory, you have to say that we have a very, very patchy record with promoting democracy and even with exporting stability. Yeah? And honestly, we have done that best where countries had the incentive or magnetic pull of the promise of EU membership and NATO membership. And when that was genuine rather than pretend, as in the case of Turkey for the EU and Georgia and Ukraine for NATO, right? When it really happened, countries were absolutely willing to change. The Balts went through brutal economic reform programs in the early 90s to be able to join the EU and NATO. Really put their entire countries through the ringer, impoverished themselves to do this. And I think they are now triumphantly, you know, in a position to serve as examples for others. But I think that I think we have to do two things at the same time. You know, this is, you know, there's this famous saying that, you know, for grown-ups can contain opposing ideas in their head at the same time. In fact, that's a mark of adulthood. So at the same time, I think we have to maintain and cherish the universality of our principles and of human rights, including for Russian civil society. I don't think we're ever going to have safety and stability on the Eurasian continent with a Russia that is the way it is now. I think the Russian system has to change, but it has to change on their terms, not ours. Yeah? But so that means, you know, sticking to our principles, but with humility. And between that lies a great grey zone. And now we've got 2 more minutes, and you want to have people ask questions.
My last question with what you said now would be, should we offer the membership to Russia when it changes? But you can think of it. I mean, this would be the logic.
You know, the problem is that both with EU and NATO membership, there are really important absorption capability questions on both sides.
Yes, of course.
The country has to change, and we have to be able to absorb it. And there is, I think, a serious proposition to be made that after a certain number of members, it becomes difficult to maintain NATO unity or credibility and or European functionality, which I think is our absorption problem. But still, I mean, I think that's TBD, to be discussed when it happens.
Yes, of course, of course. This is really a big question, but thank you so far.
Sure.
Thank you very much so far. So we have some questions here in the room. I have many of them here. Are there some in the room? Yes, the first question there.
There's one, Ivo Menzinger from Swiss Re. Constanze, you said how important American diplomacy was in the background to get to this surprisingly unified Western response. And I really don't want to invite you to speculate, but one question that I don't get out of my mind, and probably a few others as well, is what if the previous US presidential elections had had a different outcome?
We certainly wouldn't have seen that. I mean, I can tell you that, you know, Fiona Hill was my colleague whom I've referenced several times, and you should absolutely read her books. She was the senior director for Europe and Russia in the NSC during the Trump administration for 2.5 years, together with her deputy, Julia Friedlander, who came from Treasury and CIA and is a sanctions expert. And I know, at least from my German diplomat friends and also from other Europeans, that those two, I think, preserved the transatlantic alliance while Trump was trying to take it apart. I think those two really, really sort of got us through 2.5 horrific years. And we know from the book, from John Bolton's book, In the Room Where It Happened, and from other memoirs, that Trump, I think, was seriously trying to take America out of NATO. And I think if there had been a second term for Trump, he would have absolutely done that, and then we would have been in a very, very different place. It's horrific to imagine. And honestly, some of the people who are on offer for the 2024 elections, you know, who knows where they would go. I mean, let me pass one point here. I think one thing we should understand is that by acting the way we did, by taking on this burden, by energetically working with the Americans, not just on the business side of things, but also on the military side, we are taking weight off a domestically constrained and contested Biden administration. We're helping them make their case. And for the longest time, I think we weren't willing to do that. And now that we are helping make the argument that this administration is better for America than a Trump administration would have been. Something worth considering.
Constanze, thank you very much for a very fascinating tour de raison of the diplomatic considerations regarding that war. Now let us look to what could be a possible outcome and who could be a broker of peace. So the question is, you know, is China prepared, given your considerations of how China is affected, is China prepared to step in one way or the other, perhaps not directly but indirectly, and twist a little bit the arm of Putin and say, listen, you have to come to a deal? And then what could such a deal look like, and who could be the potential mediator between the various parties, the Western, the US, and the Chinese, and who has the confidence and the stamina to, to deal with such an issue?
You know, it would really take a sort of Václav Havel type person, and I don't think I'm seeing someone. I mean, the Israelis tried. Naftali Bennett's government and Naftali himself thought that they could do this. But the truth is that, of course, the Russians have significant influence in Israel through emigres and oligarchs and so on. And the Israelis ended up not being quite courageous enough for this. And I suspect the same thing is the case with the Chinese. I don't think the Chinese have decided yet, to use a colloquialism, which side their bread is buttered on. Yeah. And it may be, I'm sure they would prefer to stay on the fence, but that may become quite difficult for them. And I don't see, the Chinese playing the role of good officers, as it's called. I also don't see the UN's Guterres. I mean, in the good old days, the UN would have been the obvious person, or the UN Human Rights Commissioner, or the High Commissioner for Refugees, or something. I don't really see that. This is the problem. None of these people really have the traction, the weight, and the international credibility to do that. And so I suspect, that it also, for reasons of credibility, it really has to be Zelensky in the forefront, negotiating for himself with support and protection from the West. But I don't, right now I'm not seeing anybody who does it. And as far, I was saying earlier on your question of what a settlement would look like, I think a settlement might look like, neutrality, so, independence for the two zombie statelets or the entirety of Donbass. That may be something that the Zelensky government would be willing to contemplate, but in which case, I think that, the route of then the rump Ukraine, as it would be, into Europe in one way or another, I think would be practically assured. And I think there would have to be cast iron military guarantees as well. And of course, I mean, we would be spending a huge amount of money on the reconstruction of Ukraine. And one point that I didn't make earlier when I said that I don't think that this is inherently stable because I don't think Putin's position is stable, is that I think if a huge amount of money for reconstruction pours into Ukraine, that will make Ukraine into an economic magnet for the citizens of independent Donbass, right? And people will leave. In the same way that Russians are now leaving Russia. And so I think that, there isn't any way, there isn't any arrangement that stops the systemic competition point that I was addressing earlier, and that freezes it, or neutralizes it. I don't see it.
Mm-hmm. What should Finland do? What should Georgia do in the coming months, in the coming next years?
Well, a friend of mine emailed me from Tbilisi a couple of days ago and said, a German friend who I used to work with, said, I'm in Tbilisi and it's full of Russians. They're all sitting here in suitcases. So this is, one of the sort of odd characteristics that Georgia, not just under Saakashvili, but afterwards as well, always wanted to ally itself with Europe, but of course also has profound, historical relationships with Russia, just as Ukraine has, right? And so for the Georgians, I think this is genuinely tricky, also because the Georgians have the unfortunate problem of being in a sort of particularly bad area of real estate. Yeah? I mean, remember that the Russians in 2008 sort of walked away with Abkhazia and North Ossetia, which is not exactly, Abkhazia is nice, but North Ossetia isn't. If you've already got Ingushetia and Dagestan, you don't really want to add North Ossetia to your collections, and Chechnya. All those guys are, not sort of, not healthy to have around. Sorry, and this is sounding incredibly prejudiced, but you know what I mean. These have been historically permanent sources of unrest and quasi-tribal warfare for the Russians, and where the Russians, of course, with their brutal war, their two wars in Chechnya, have wreaked havoc as well. And so Georgia, I think, is genuinely tricky, also because the Russians have really, sided with Azerbaijan in the Azeri-Armenian war 2 years ago, and I think that is inherently more unstable. For the Finns and the Swedes, those poll numbers have been going up. Week by week, the polls in Finland of those saying, we should be members of NATO at once are going up. And I think if the Russians, again, that is, thank you, Mr. Putin. Yeah? That was unthinkable previously. I have lots of friends in Finland and Sweden who are always saying, no, we will never do this. Never going to happen, not in our lifetimes. Well, that moment has come. And I think sort of, just Putin threatening nuclear weapons, shooting up nuclear power plants, is enough to go make Finns and Swedes go wobbly. Yeah? And the irony of this is, of course, that they have been, perfect members of NATO, almost spending 2% on defense in every partnership, format that you can possibly be without being an actual member of NATO. Arguably, they were better members of NATO than many actual members of NATO were. So for them, joining now would practically be a formality. And I think, this could be done, from one day to the next. And the point about their military policy is they wouldn't have to actually change much about what they was doing, because they're already doing everything and more. Yeah? And I think that that's a distinct possibility. And frankly, what I meant earlier when I was talking about resilience of the West, if I were the Irish and if I were the Austrians, and if I were the Norwegians and the Finns and the Swedes, I would seriously consider, joining everything there is to join.
And if you were a Swiss?
And the Swiss, very interesting question. At this point, my understanding, I don't know.
Just looking from
all I know,
abroad,
I know. Well, let me put it this way. Your economic and financial sector is already and for the foreseeable future a front line of the weaponization of economic interdependence, right? And that's what it's going to be. There is no réduit for you, and there hasn't been for a while. And your joining the sanctions is proof of that. But when you were asking your question about the big picture, I think what we've seen is that one thing that's really been disproven in this past year and these few weeks is that the sort of Trumpian and right-wing populist idea that we could somehow revert to a Europe of nation states where we all have economic autarky and we repatriate value chains, it just doesn't work. Economic and technological, and also, frankly, social and cultural interdependence is such that the kinds of conflicts that we will be looking at in the future will be conflicts between countries that are profoundly interdependent with each other, and that can't really change that. But where, in fact, this interdependence is weaponized both by adversaries and, in the case of Trump, by allies. And so I think that Switzerland, needs to have, not needs to have, I'm not here to lecture you, I would be presumptuous, but if I were Swiss and thinking about Swiss security policy, I would say that this fact of the weaponization of economic interdependence and the importance of resilience could warrant a sort of very, very thorough re-examination of Swiss security policy. And including economic and financial policy. And not to, again, to cut things off, but to make relationships more resilient and to sort of stress-proof them against them being weaponized.
With this, we have already answered more or less two questions that are here about Swiss sanctions and neutrality and about Sweden and Finland in the NATO. But I will take two other questions together because they're quite the opposite. One guest says, with respect to taking Putin seriously, should the Russian or Putin security concern, such as a NATO free buffer zone on the country's western border, have been taken more seriously? And one other says or asks, why is nobody talking about the security threats that the highly armed Russian enclave poses to the EU?
You mean Kaliningrad? Yeah.
Yes, and it's not far away.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Who threats whom? This is the question that we have there.
So, again, look, if you look at Kremlin sort of propaganda maps of why the Kremlin is threatened by there are two sets of maps out there. There is a NATO map which says, but we only have, Russia stretches across, 11 time zones, and only a tiny part of its western border is actually contiguous to NATO. And Western missiles, such as they are, might reach until the Urals, but that's it, right? The Kremlin maps, if you've ever seen one of those, you can find them on Twitter, have little NATO signs practically surrounding Russia. The Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, the Philippines, and so on. And the reason for that is that America has so many bases there, and the French and the Chinese also have bases. Now, you can make a slightly disingenuous argument that only a fraction of American forces is actually committed to NATO, which is why it's not sort of helpful to put NATO stickers on them. They're actually not part of NATO's force dispositives, and I don't think ever will be. But are they part of American or French or English dispositives? Yes, of course, but those, frankly, those have always been there. Those had nothing to do, they were there well before NATO expansion, right? They're part of the sort of, in fact, they remained despite decolonization. Yeah? And so I think that, frankly, the reason why the Kremlin sees them as a security threat is not because we've changed or done things, but because the Kremlin has changed. And because the Kremlin has become increasingly dependent, I mean, in a sort of a mobster sort of way, on power verticals, on a society, on a social contract whereby people, are willing to forego democratic rights in exchange for stability. And now that they no longer have stability, they're saying, well, frankly, then honestly, foregoing my democratic rights to you doesn't look so good anymore, right? So the Kremlin, by sort of narrowing, sort of in a sort of tunnel-like way, its perspective on its Western European border, on its relationship with America, and on its relationship with its own civil society, I think has literally sort of, painted itself into a corner where everything looks like an adversary. With a more relaxed Russian government that was more confident about offering a system of governance that was maybe not a Western democracy but worked for Russian citizens, you wouldn't have had this, right? But the fact that European democracy is what threatens Putin tells you everything. That's our problem here.
One last question from here. We didn't talk about, there are many others that we talk about more or less. What will the discovery of nuclear weapons do to the young and very young generations to whom it seemed more hidden compared to us? So.
Yes, well.
Just to have a guess, I mean,
sure, yeah.
They should answer themselves.
Oh, but by the way, I forgot the Kaliningrad question. I mean, I think the Kaliningrad question is very serious. So the Russians, have mobile Iskander missiles that they can station in Kaliningrad, which is, I mean, basically in walking distance of the three Baltic states. And the security provision that we had so far is what is called a tripwire, sort of, rudimentary rotating NATO forces, but not really the kind of presence that would actually stop the Russians from making a territorial grab. Now, at this point, I actually think that the Russians have so far constrained themselves and are being constrained in a way that I actually think a Russian attack on NATO territory is less likely now than it was, say, 3 weeks ago or even 2 weeks ago. Don't hold me to it. I hope I'm not proven wrong. But I think it just looks worse for the Kremlin now. But I think that is an argument. I mean, there are 3 things we could talk about if we want to talk about defense, deterrence, and resilience for Europe. One is saying, okay, the Russia-NATO Founding Act of 1997 has been blown off the table by the Russians. We might as well formally state that we no longer consider ourselves bound by it. It is rendered obsolete, or as the Americans say, OBE, overtaken by events, and that we therefore now will move to permanent forward basing of NATO forces on NATO's eastern flank. I think I'd be very surprised if that's not discussed at next week's NATO summit. The other thing that we can discuss is stationing forward basing of missiles to address the Kaliningrad issue. And again, I think that we now have a serious case for doing that. And finally, I think because of the problem of return of Trump or Trumpism, the latter I think likelier than the former, there is going to be a non-academic debate again about a European nuclear deterrent, which the French might push or not. We'll see. But nuclear weapons, I mean, I too would like a nuclear-free world. I really would. But in the world that we have, they're there. And I think that this is probably not the moment to get rid of ours. Despite the fact that, unfortunately, in a situation like this, the notion of a nuclear balance, of nuclear stability, is, I think, at this point, entirely academic. Because of the death of arms control treaties, because of the return to a politics of aggression in violation of international law. But I mean, the nuclear weapons are there, and this is not a propitious moment for engaging in arms control and disarmament. I would hope that with a Russian, I mean, if there is a change in Russia at some point, maybe only in 20, 30 years, where you have a new Russian generation of policymakers that says, well, this basically led us near to the, close to the abyss in economic terms, political terms, in terms of international legitimacy. We don't want that anymore. With a Russia that changes the way it governs itself, you could talk about nuclear disarmament, but I don't think before. And I am sorry, I will say this, it is now a little more than 30 years since the fall of the wall, and my generation were in their mid-20s when the wall fell, and it seems to me that the world that we have, as we have managed it, I think we owe an apology to today's 20 years old. I think we've done a really terrible job. I think we owe the biggest apology to the Ukrainians. I really do. And I think this is what I meant earlier by humility. I think that we have very little to congratulate ourselves for. I mean, the show of unity here is, on Russia's attack is good. But if we don't, in the same breath, acknowledge the mistakes that we've made, the lives that were lost on our watch, and the hubris that we engaged in, and the double standards, the opportunism, and I speak particularly for my own country, if we don't acknowledge that, we will not get anywhere. And I think that's where we have to start. It's not pleasant, but that's the way it is.
Thank you very much, Constanze. I will not add anything to that because this is a moment to stop here. Thank you very much to you. Thank you very much to you, the audience here in the room. Thank you very much to those at home. And see you soon at next SIAF Talk in June.
Thank you for inviting me. This was lovely. It's been a pleasure.